philanthropic world in a time of corona could not be more germane or relevant. I am pleased to hand over today's program to our wonderful moderator, to Dr. Matt Plen, the Chief Executive of Masorti UK. Matt.
Oh, mute's going on and off the first and last time, hopefully, in this. I think everyone can hear me now. Is that okay? Great. So thank you so much, Rabbi Phil. It's wonderful to be here and to be asked to moderate this talk with such a distinguished international audience of so many good friends. So welcome to everyone. And I'd now like to introduce our guest speaker. I'm sure you know, the Jewish Funders Network is an international community of private foundations and philanthropists with over 2,500 members from 11 countries around the world. It's one of the major funding networks in the Jewish world, and we're delighted to have its president here, Andres Spokoiny. Tehila is posting his bio in the chat box so everyone can read and get a little bit more information. But I would like to maximize the time that we have for the talk. So we're going to hand straight over. And the way this is going to work is we'll take, Andres is going to speak for up to about 40 minutes. We'll then have some time for Q&A, questions and answers. We have a couple of questions that have been pre-submitted, so we'll go to those first, and we'll then have time for a few questions from everybody else. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Andres. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a big pleasure to be here with all of you. I am a proud product of the Masorti movement. It made me who I am, and I'm eternally grateful for that. And I feel very close to all the work you're trying to do around the world. As Matt said, these are very challenging times. That's a truism already. But I think that they're challenging times because they are compounding. You know, coronavirus is compounding some changes in philanthropy that we were seeing in the past as well. Like it's not really bringing new challenges. It's bringing new technical challenges, but in terms of the big trends, is probably accelerating some of the trends. So let's start let's start from Mina Klal Laprat, from the most general to the more particular. What was happening in philanthropy before coronavirus, right? The main change that we saw in philanthropy, that we were seeing in philanthropy in the last 10 years, and every year it gets accelerated, is the individualization of philanthropy, right? In the past, philanthropy used to be mostly communal. In other words, if you lived in the United States, your main vehicle to give philanthropy was the federation. In other communities, you have a central keilah. And it moves then from, because the society moves from the collective to the individual. So philanthropy also moves from the communal to the private. There's a privatization of Jewish philanthropy. Now, for you to understand how big this process is, you need to understand that in the last 20 years, there are close to 40,000 new private foundations in the United States. Vehicles like donor advised funds that are, for those of you not in the US, this is a special way of doing philanthropy, that you give it to somebody, but you actually retain your capacity of directing where that money goes. Donor advised funds are up 12% a year, while every other form of philanthropy is flat. So there are actually 3 times more donor advised funds today than there were 10 years ago. In other words, there was, and there still is, a process of great individualization of Jewish philanthropy. And that is not only something that happens in philanthropy, right? There's individualization in everything. You feel it in your activities. You feel it in your synagogues, right? Like there's the center of the society moves from the collective to the individual. Now, there is another element that goes together with this, which is the disintermediation of philanthropy. What do I mean by that? We use, for every aspect of our economic activity, for anything we used to do in the past, we always had an intermediate, right? So let's say you wanted to take a trip. You used an intermediate. You use a travel agent, right? Now, who used a travel agent in the last 5 years, right? It disappeared. The same is happening in philanthropy. We see a disintermediation of society because the individual has a lot of tools at his disposal. So she doesn't need an intermediate anymore. So we cut the middleman, and we cut the middleman in philanthropy as well. If the federation or the kehillah or the synagogue even was my intermediate between me and my philanthropy, between me and the recipient of my philanthropy, I don't need them anymore. I can do, I get online and I can find all the different causes that I care about, right? So individualization, cutting the middleman, cutting the intermediate segment of in philanthropy and in every aspect of society. I mean, that impacts you also not only in your fundraising. That impacts you in your religious activities, right? Like there's no intermediate for religion either. Like the rabbi, the synagogue, their role is very different today because the identity is self-built. You build your own identity and you pick and choose, right? So the same happens with your philanthropy. You pick and choose. The other thing that was happening before Corona and is still happening now is something that I call the end of loyalty. So in the past, there was a notion that whatever happens, you're loyal to that organization. Your parents gave to this or that community, to this or that synagogue. You're gonna keep on giving. Yes, you can fight with a rabbi and splinter and create another one. But in general, there was a notion of loyalty to the organization. That doesn't exist anymore. Donors today do not have any sense of loyalty to an organization. I mean, it's a generalization. Some, of course, do, but in general, donors today are loyal to causes, not to organization. And what they are going to do is they're going to shop around to see what is the best vehicle to satisfy their needs. In other words, let's say I care about Jews in need. In the past, I would have loyalty to the federation. I would give them a check every year. So today, my loyalty is not the federation, is the cause, Jews in need. Every year, I'm going to check who satisfies that need the best, right? So it's a major change in how philanthropy is taking place. The other thing that is happening at a very accelerated pace is that the philanthropy of 20 years ago was very single, it went through a single vehicle. You wrote a check. Philanthropy meant writing a check. Today, philanthropy means a ton of different things. Like there are, for example, things like impact investing, where people actually do commercial investments that are that have a philanthropic goal. There are social enterprises. There are giving circles, where people get together and give together in a group of peers. There are there's crowdfunding. There's tons of new vehicles that complicate the landscape of philanthropy, complicate or enrich, right? Depends how you look at it. And again, the most important thing for people when they give, the single most important driver of their giving is impact. Donors seek impact. We survey, for example, our members, the JFN members, and and we asked them, what do you look, why do you give? What's the motivation for giving? 14%, 1/4, told us that their motivation for giving was a sense of obligation. And 72% told us that they gave to achieve impact. And the impact that they're achieving was the most important thing that they looked when they make a gift. So that changes dramatically how you present yourself, right? Because if you used to go to a donor and say, hey, you have to give us money because you have an obligation to the community, you know that only 14% of people are going to respond to that. Now, if you go to a donor and you say, your donation to my synagogue, to my congregation, achieves this impact on the ground, that becomes a much more powerful argument, especially for the younger donor. I mean, all these trends accelerate with the younger donors, right? So that's one thing. The other element that I'm sure you're seeing it, and it's also pre-corona, but it's even now much more acute. The main driver of giving is personal engagement. Donors today want to be personally engaged with the organization and the causes they give to, right? The way in which you get donors today is not by doing a sales pitch, but by engaging them. The more a donor will be engaged with you, the more they will give you. The problem, of course, is that now in Corona time, how do you engage donors? But we're going to get there in a minute. We're going to get to the specific challenges of Corona. By the way, if you guys want to put questions or things that I say are not very clear and you want to ask in the chat, please feel free, and I'll try to relate to that, okay? Because I'm assuming everybody's on the same page. So don't be shy. So I said personal engagement, right? Personal engagement is important. Donors don't want to see themselves as walking wallets. They want to see themselves as people to be engaged. And but that is also another problem, because donors want to be personally engaged and they want to see where their money is going. They want to be able to identify the impact that they did. That determines that there is a rise in what we call in the trade designated giving, as opposed to undesignated giving. Less and less people are going to give you money for the synagogue as a whole. Rather, they're going to give you for this or that program. So people are designating their donations. That is good on the one hand, because it allows you to do a lot of new programs and stuff, but it's bad on the other hand, because obviously people give you money for specific programs, but nobody gives you money to turn on the heating or to turn on the lights, right? Like if you were able to choose where your taxes go, nobody will pay for the sewage. So the designation of donors of donations is creating a lot of issues there. Now, how is philanthropy changing this? How is coronavirus changing this landscape? I don't think it's changing it, rather it's accelerating it. One of the things that we're seeing is a lot of donors, for example, rushing to help, but we're seeing a big polarization in the donor population. The major donors are doing fine during the crisis. The smaller donors are suffering, right? So there's going to be an acceleration of the reliance of the community in bigger donors. For example, in the United States, the big foundations stepped up. They created a multi-million-dollar relief fund, but the individuals giving money to synagogues, schools, JCCs, whatever, these guys are suffering. So they're suffering because the business is down, because they might have lost their jobs. And so there is going to be a loss of revenue in that lower end, and there's going to be a need of compensating that revenue. There is also a problem in the traditional ways in which people used to raise money. And every organization in the world is suffering with things like we used to do our annual gala dinner, and we can't do it now. So how do we raise that money? I don't have to tell you guys about Yamim Noraim appeals and Kol Nidre appeals, right? So how that is going to happen. So the challenge here is going to be to replace those in a creative way, while at the same time addressing the trends that I was mentioning at the beginning. You know, not relying only on obligation, but also although obligation here, it's coming back as to sustain the community, but also as a way of saying, this is what the community needs now. It's not about us. It's not about congregation Beit Yaakov in Nashville. It's about what the community needs now, and how are we, our congregation, is ready to help and ready to provide what the community needs. It's never, fundraising is never about the organization. It's about the impact that the organization has. So that's going to be the world of philanthropy is going to be very highly impacted by this. The other thing that is going to happen is that a lot of funders are going to start asking what I call the ventilator question. When in New York, when the peak of the pandemic was here, there was this whole debate about who gets the ventilator, right? If you have two patients, one is 90 years old and had 2 strokes, and the other one is 25, and you have 1 ventilator, who do you give it to, right? So funders are asking that question as well in philanthropy, as cruel as it sounds. They say, well, we have limited resources and the entire community system is at risk. So who gets the ventilator? Who are we supporting? Who are we saving in this crisis, right? And the question that funders are asking is, like doctors, who had comorbidities? In other words, if you get to this crisis and you were teetering in a normal year, if every month you have trouble making payroll, and every year you are at the verge of closing, so maybe we need to let you close. Maybe we need to use this crisis as an opportunity to really close you down and have you start again in new ways. So this is also something that is going to come very, very strongly. There's going to be a lot of pressure from funders on you guys to take this not as a blip, but as an earthquake, and think, how do you respond and how you restructure the community with, in the new reality. There's going to be a lot of pressure on congregations to merge, or not necessarily to merge, but to sort of be much more efficient and be strategically aligned. I'm seeing it in my shul around the corner. Like there's 4 conservative synagogues where I live in Brooklyn, and they are collaborating much more. The youth program is shared, and the cultural program now is shared. They didn't merge, but they doing a lot of stuff together. So there's going to be a ton of pressure from the funders. I mean, it's the right thing to do, but the funders are going to force you to do it too, because they're going to say, listen, when everybody needs a ventilator, we don't have the leeway to support everything. So collaborate and be much more efficient. So that's one thing. The second thing is that there's something paradoxical that is happening with the pandemic, which is that people are getting used to higher quality in some of the programs that they were consuming. In other words, if in the past I would go to the shul around the corner to listen to a shir from some community member who maybe read a book or two, now online I have access to the best speakers in the world. So it's a paradox here, right? Like you can't meet, you can't raise money, but you need to provide activities in a much higher quality that you used to, because people are getting used to very high quality. So it's sort of a perfect storm in that sense. Now, having said all this, I think that for the organizations that can pivot, that seems to be the word of the year, to pivot, right? To sort of change direction and do things a little different. There's a big opportunity to be very successful in fundraising. So, for example, congregations that are that have a robust, or that can develop a robust social welfare program could be very attractive for donors. So one of the things that we discovered during the crisis in 2008 was that synagogues and something like the Rabbi Discretionary Fund was a great tool of providing poverty relief. People wouldn't go to a poverty relief agency, but they would talk to the rabbi, and the rabbi could, discreetly help them. So, in other words, it's just an example, but the notion that you can actually use this crisis in ways that that sort of enrich your programming and make you much more relevant for funders. One more thing, and I want to open it up. I can talk forever, but I want to open it up for questions and for comments. One of the things that I think is very important is that this crisis of the coronavirus, happens in a time in which, because of all the things that I said before at the very beginning, the individualization, the changes in society, it comes at a time where we were already, Masorti communities, Orthodox community, Reform communities, everybody was due for an upgrade. Everybody was due to sort of think about the future of how synagogues work, even the ideological future of the denominations, like what do we believe in and stuff like that. I think that all these questions are going to become much, much more acute in the future. I think that, yes, how to replace the Kol Nidre appeal is a big question, but even a bigger question is, what are people going to need from religion after the pandemic? Don't forget that after every pandemic, there's a religious reckoning. There's upheaval. After the Black Death, the Catholic Church started to go down, and Reformation came up. Even in other places, like in Japan, for example, in the 7th century, there was a big smallpox epidemic that resulted, from all things, in the adoption of Buddhism in the country. In other words, after every brush with death like this, people have existential questions, right? So it's true, we need to focus on, how to raise money, but we also have to not lose sight that the main problems that people are going to be facing are going to also be spiritual and existential, and they're going to be looking for answers in our communities, and if we don't do it, they're going to look for it somewhere else. So I got to stop here, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions, and I want to leave enough time for us to have a dialogue about it. So
great, thank you so much, Andres. So just to highlight a few, I think, of the important things you said, and then we're going to see what questions people have to ask. So I heard a few really important things there. Number one, a couple of general trends. You talked about more individualism and an individual approach among donors. You talked about an emphasis on impact rather than loyalty to organizations. I'm sure we've all experienced that in our work. And then on the back of the coronavirus crisis, I heard 4 really important things that you said. First of all, the fact that funders need to prioritize because the demands are greater and the pressure on our organizations to collaborate or even to merge. Second of all, the nature of remote digital working means there's more competition and we have to work to a higher level of quality. Third of all, the absolute necessity to be flexible as organizations and to be able to pivot to meet new needs. And finally, and I think this was really fascinating, I'd love to hear more about this actually, the need that we're going to have after the pandemic to refocus back on our core purpose. And it's not going to be enough to think about how do we raise the money, but we have to think about what is our purpose in the world and how do we meet the deep existential spiritual needs of the people that we're trying to cater for. So I think that's a really good opening and a great start, and thank you for that. And we're going to go to questions. So the way we're going to do this is we have a couple of questions that have been submitted in advance, and then we're going to open up. Tehila is going to call on people. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Tehila is going to be looking at that box and calling on people. If she is able to get to your question, she will then call on you and unmute you. You'll then be able to ask your question. Now I'm aware that what I'm about to say is counterintuitive in any kind of Jewish framework, but I would like to ask for everybody to keep their questions as short as possible so that there's enough time for Andres to respond to lots and lots of points. And I think it would be really good if the questions were questions rather than what sometimes happens in these occasions, which is speeches with a question mark tacked on the end. So really short questions would be great so we can get to as many people as possible and to let us get the benefit of Andres's wisdom as well. So I'll hand over to Tehila, who's going to call on the questioners. Thanks, Tehila.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Andres. So the first question came in from Rabbi Peretz Rodman, who just joined the call. Do you want to, I see you're on mute. Let's see if you want to ask your question. If not, I will read it. Okay. He's not allowing me to unmute him. So I'll just read his question. Does Mr. Spokoiny think that at present, North American Jewish leaders are more focused on North American Jewish life, or perhaps are they able to focus on the tremendous needs in smaller, more vulnerable Jewish communities around the world?
It's a great question. Please don't just call me Andres. No, Mr. Spokoiny make me feel even older. Again, the pandemic here is actually accelerating a trend. We live in a time of, where the world was moving towards isolationism, like between America first and in the one hand and Brexit on the other and nationalism everywhere. So there was a trend already to focus on yourself first, on your country first. And now, of course, is accelerating. So those of you that depend a lot on foreign funds are gonna be in trouble. I don't know. Actually, I don't know if it's a fact or it's a fatality that you're gonna be in trouble, but you're gonna need to think of the added problem of donors much more focused on their immediate community. I mean, the need in the United States is very big. It's also kind of the first global crisis in which actually the United States is more affected than other places, right? So for you to give you an example, the aggregate deficit of the camping system, of the summer camps in the United States this year was around $200 million. It's the money that the camps are not getting for not being able to conduct summer sessions. So, and everybody's in the same thing. There is, day schools are telling you we're going to have a drop in tuition next year, and and JCCs let go half of their payrolls. So there is a sense of a very acute local need. Now, that doesn't mean that funders don't care about the things they used to care, right? If you care about Jewish life everywhere, you can still make a case that we are a Jewish people and the value of global Jewish people is important, especially now. And you can make a case that as bad as it is in the United States, it could be worse in other countries. But you kind of have to make that case. It's not going to be automatic. It's not going to be, you're going to need to sort of have a narrative to sort of justify why, in a time of enormous local need, you need people to keep being focused on overseas needs. The good news is that I've seen the concern, but I haven't seen a disastrous drop, for example, in donations to Israel, or in donations to the Joint, for example, that gives overseas. I mean, there's not a major decrease. There is concern, but there's not a major decrease. Now, of course, this is a moving target, right? Like at the beginning, we all thought this was going to be a 2-week thing, and then we're going to be fine. And now, we're months into this, so with time this gets compounded. But yeah, but it is going to be something that you guys will need to consider. But let me just add one thing here. What this crisis showed is the notion of fragility and vulnerability. Here's the thing. If you depended on a single source of income, your situation was very fragile, right? So let's say JCCs depend mostly on fee per service, right? They can't do services, they can't get fees, they're screwed, Now, if a synagogue somewhere in the world depends on foreign contributions, and their contribution, their dependence is very big, now the foreign contributions go down, they're in trouble. So I think when you rethink going out of the crisis, one of the things has to be, how do we make our revenue stream less fragile? Pachot pagia, like less vulnerable, right? So one of the rule of thumbs that I use is never have one source of funding being more than 15% of your revenue. No one donor, because then you need to be able to lose your major donor and not close. And of course it can take you 10 years to get there, right? But that has to be in the top of your mind.
Thank you.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you, Andres. I think Tila, should we go to the next question?
Yes. So next question is from Edwin Lucas from the UK, who's not on the call. What is the best way to engage in tomorrow, today, for the future of the Masorti membership? Easy.
That's a biggie. So first of all, again, don't make it about you. I mean, in other words, don't make it about the organizations. I mean, like, people today, and I'm talking, everybody's biased, right? Everybody's talking from their own perspective. I think that talking about denominations and talking about, denominations are a thing of the 19th century, and Jews are not there. How many true Masorti Jews are there, in the sense that how many people really go to the Masorti synagogue because they read and understand and studied, Zecharia Frankel and Solomon Schechter? They're there because, other things, because it's a gateway to Jewish life. So I would say the way to engage is to speak the cultural language of the time. I mean, it's a delicate balance, because on the one hand, you want to be consistent, you want to be true to certain values. On the other hand, but the expression of those values has to be changed. The other thing that I would say, and this is we're opening here a big Pandora box, but I think it's important to think how organizations are being organized in the 21st century. In the past, organizations were pyramidal, like they were producing stuff. You have General Motors who produce cars. Now today, organizations are different. Organizations that are successful are platforms. are not producing anything. I mean, they're producing connections, right? So think about it this way. The biggest taxi company in the world does not own a single car. Now it's Uber. The biggest hotel company in the world, Airbnb, doesn't own a single hotel room. What do they own? They own the platform, right? So my question to you would be, could be a way to engage Jews and 21st century Jews, by serving as a platform that facilitates their self-expression, that facilitates their connection to other Jews, and that lets them generate content. In other words, there's a dance here between, in the old paradigm, you were generating content and sending it down the pyramid. Today is different. Like in YouTube, people watch videos, but people also upload videos, right? So I'm wondering if that is not a metaphor for some of the stuff that we can be doing in the Jewish communities as well.
Great, thank you, Andres. Just before we go to the next question, we're going to have time for one or two more questions, I think. So everyone's encouraged to type into the chat box and figure out what else you'd like Andres to talk about. If not, I have a couple of questions lined up. So if you want to avoid hearing my questions, now's the time to put the questions in the chat box. Let's have the next one we've got though, Tehila, in the meantime.
Yes, Freddie, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Okay, so Andres, I've been a fundraiser for 30 years.
Yeah.
And what I know is that relationship is key to donor giving.
Correct.
Yeah, so given the inability to personally connect, how does one sustain or what is the role of relationship today?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, you're absolutely right. Philanthropy is about two things. It's about relationships and it's about engagement. And that's again, because, and that becomes even more important. I'm going to be a little digression here. That becomes even more important in a time of highly individualized philanthropy, because there's no one approach, there's no one size fits all, and you probably know this from your work, right? Like, because it's highly individualized, every donor needs to be approached with a different message and with a different approach. So relations are critical, and working on these relations is just simply, vital. How do you keep relations? That is a tricky question. Now, but I'm going to tell you one of the paradoxes here. On the one hand, it's true. In this time of Zoom and no physical relationship, it's very hard to keep relations. But the organization that I ran, the Jewish Funders Network, we actually quadrupled our participation in programs. Hell, I talk to my mother every day. I never used to do that. So there is a paradox here, and there is a way of keeping the connections alive in this time. But I think that the question is, going back to the point of high quality content, high quality interactions. People are getting tired of Zoom. So the question is, okay, you do a Zoom, but what do you do there, right? How can you make these things interactive? So for example, we had a mixology class on Zoom. Like, we were teaching people to do drinks, and then we had somebody, I don't know, there's gonna need to be ideas of how to keep the relation. But thinking about how to keep the relationship going is important. Sometimes not talking at people, but providing a space for them to speak can be very important. Our most successful programs are those in which people speak and people talk about what is bothering them. So you give that. It's very critical. But then I think in the long term, Freddie, I think in the long term, the work of the fundraiser in the future is going to be very, very close, very, very similar to the work of the engagement professional, because, as I said, the only reliable predictor of giving is engagement. So you will need to, whatever you do in the short term, in the long term, you will need to think about your job as an engagement job rather than as a sales job.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, Andres. Tila, I think we have another question.
So we have another question from Emily Levy-Shochet from Israel. Just unmute yourself.
Hi, hi, I'm sitting here in Israel, and your idea of mixology is very good because I'm about to have my evening wine, so that's good news.
Oh.
But my question is much more serious than that, Andres, and it's a sensitive one. Assuming that there are many philanthropists who have been supportive of Israel, and specifically of Masorti, but certainly of Israel, are unhappy. We know there's a certain element of people who are unhappy with Israel's behaviors vis-a-vis minorities. I won't be more specific than that. Jewish minorities, non-Jewish minorities, all sorts of things. What do you suggest to us sitting around who are dealing and trying to raise money? I know specifically from Masorti, but we in Masorti can't make believe we're not part of this. I don't think.
Right.
Your comments, please.
So one of it, it's part of the isolationist thing. A lot of people are disengaging from Israel, but the truth is, I haven't seen yet the impact on philanthropy of, and I don't mince words. I mean, I'm not political, but I do think that what the government, the current government is doing in terms of dialogue with the diaspora is terrible, and it's just a miracle that it hasn't impacted much more giving to Israel. Somehow, philanthropy has been preserved, and you can actually use that as an argument. You can say, listen, we are, with the excuse of Corona, a lot of advances that we had or that we had achieved are being reversed. Under the cloud of Corona, and I'm just giving this as an example, it's not, the government is, withdrawing things that they had agreed to do that. I mean, eventually, what you have to impress upon people is that what happens in Israel, especially in terms of Jewish pluralism, impacts them. It's not something. So you will want to visit Israel one day and be recognized as a Jew, right? Mm-hmm. You will want. So that's a very powerful argument, I think. Now, there is a role here for the movement as a movement to do advocacy with the government and trying to tell them, that this is tricky. Now, the real problem, I think, will happen for people that want to remain, quote unquote, parve in political things, because then you're going to be, as we say, nishtain nishtaer. You're not going to be, you're going to try to work on a consensus that doesn't exist anymore. And that is going to make it very hard for the people that want to be more militant to identify with you. So that's going to be the conundrum. But that conundrum is not just yours. It happens to every organization that tries to be pluralist in this day and age. They have big problems, because what happens is that they can't hold inside all the polarization of the Jewish opinions. So this is going to be one of the things that you will have to deal with. But you will have to stand for something. You will have to be militant in what you believe, because people, when you say that, people are going to help you. People are going to believe.
Great, thank you, Andres. I'm going to ask a question. I don't think we've got more questions from the participants. I have one last question that I'd like to ask you, which is that in my recent experience is a number of donors saying because of the crisis, there are so many demands on their resources that they have to reprioritize, as you were alluding to before. And people talk about, primarily they talk about non-Jewish, well, if they talk about Jewish charities, they talk about charities which are feeding Jews and dealing with poverty. But actually, primarily people are talking about the importance of giving to non-Jewish causes, whether that's food banks, medical charities, anti-racist work at the moment, and the arts, theatre, and so on. And I wonder if you've got any insights on that as a trend, that balance between Jewish and non-Jewish philanthropic commitment among Jewish donors. And what, so first of all, kind of what's your analysis of that? And second of all, do you have any suggestions as to how Jewish organizations like ours could respond?
Yeah. All right. That's a great question. I would say two things. The boat of Jewish, non-Jewish already sailed, meaning the number of people giving only to Jewish causes is negligible. It's actually, we know how it is, it's actually 4%. 4% of Jews give only to Jewish causes. And that, you know, and not only that, the bigger gifts that donors make go to non-Jewish causes. It's actually 80-20. And this isn't the people that give Jewishly, right? Like, I'm not talking about folk like, you know, Jews that don't give Jewishly at all, including some of the biggest fortunes in the country. So that boat has already sailed. So the question is, what do we do with that? Again, if we try the road of obligation and guilt, it's not going to work. If you say, oh, you have to give Jewish because whatever, and you're a traitor, you know, like it's just not gonna work. I think that the solution is to embrace people's different needs and different opinions. I think that that's what you need to do, and work with whatever interest people bring. Now, one of the things that is an aha moment for many funders is when I tell them that whatever they care about in the non-Jewish space has a Jewish outlet. You know, they care about working in developing countries. I tell them, well, did you look at AJWS? Did you look at Israel? Did you look at, you know, and then they say, oh, I didn't think I could actually link the Jewish with the non-Jewish, right? And that brings them in. That's one thing. The second thing is trying to use whatever interest the people brings to you as a conversation starter. I'll give you a true example of two JFN members that came talking to me that I talked to both of them separately, and I discovered, go figure, that both of them had an interest in preservation of big cats, you know, felines like the Cantors and lions and whatever, and cheetahs and whatever. Go figure. The two of them, they're very different people, different parts of the world, they cared about that. So I talked to both of them. I said, hey, you guys care about this. Why don't we create a Jewish initiative for animal welfare? You know, something of that. I don't remember exactly, but something of the sort. But you understand the dance here. I didn't say that the interest is illegitimate. I didn't say give the money to me instead of giving it to a cheetah. I said, you know, let's work with your interest, right? And it's a very subtle way of doing this. Now, it is important not to be something that you're not. In other words, I didn't go out and say, I'm gonna now starting doing protection of cheetahs and panthers, right? Like I didn't, because that's inauthentic. Like people today look authenticity. So it's a delicate dance here. On the one hand, they want you to embrace multiple interests and multiple passions. On the other hand, they want authenticity, right? So it is tricky. But I think that every one of these, I look at every one of the secular interests of the donors as an opportunity for personal engagement. As simple as that. And I think that's the way we have to do it with the work here of the anti-racism work and whatever, and always, and people are not stupid. Like, what is the specific Jewish angle that you're bringing? In other words, why am I working on anti-racism with you rather than with the ACLU or something like that? Like when I was young in Buenos Aires, we had the Jewish Movement for Human Rights, and there was a debate at the time. I mean, and Mauricio probably remembers. Do we need a Jewish movement for human rights? I mean, there is already amnesty. There is already this. Well, so why to have? And it was important to articulate what is unique about the Jewish aspect of this. And I think that here's the same question too. If you're just going to try to mimic what others do, it's just not going to be authentic. Now, if you say we have a specific message to say, you know, in the anti-racist fight, for example, that's going to be much more powerful.
Great, thank you, Andres. We have time for one last question. Tehila.
Yes, last question from Gidon Aronoff in New York. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Andres, for this presentation. It's been extremely thought-provoking. In the U.S. context, I'm curious if you've seen trends of donors moving more towards political giving, giving to candidates in the election cycle, and saying, we'll get to our normal philanthropic interests after the election. And people trying to counteract that in the broader Jewish philanthropic field.
Yeah, great question. I would say less than I thought. It appears to me that, especially the big donors, they kind of have, it's as if they use different pockets in a way. I don't think that the major donors are cutting on their philanthropy to give politically. I think that, you know, people give politically all the time. It's not just when there's an election, and there's an election every 2 years. So all the time people give money, and it's sort of baked in already, I think. What I do see, and this yes, maybe a change, especially in the next few months. I saw a couple of foundations, not a lot, but a significant number, focusing on things like voter turnout, you know, get at the vote campaigns, or for example, things like civics training, or, you know, education for democracy and freedom of press work or stuff like that. That did happen. And that, yes, that competes more with philanthropy, because in the U.S. context, for those of you not in the U.S., I mean, there's what we call the 501c3 and C4. The C3 is sort of non-profit and tax exempt. When you give to a campaign, it's not tax exempt, so it doesn't come out of your foundation. It comes out of a different. You give it out of your own money. But things like get at the vote campaign, things like civic education, those things are considered C3. So that does compete with other philanthropic issues. So here again, I mean, those things can be a lever to connect people Jewishly. I know of 2 foundations, at least, in the Jewish Founders Network that are doing programs of Jewish engagement around democracy. You know, democracy and civil discourse and, you know, freedom and whatever. And they're doing this wonderful program about, you know, comparison of the American Constitution and Jewish, you know, civic rights. And they're doing even one foundation is actually doing a contest among Jewish organizations that foster Jewish civic engagement. It's just very, very interesting, right? So again, you know, it is, frankly, if me as a donor too, I'm giving money to things because it's an election year that I wouldn't, but I also see it as an opportunity to expand the Jewish experience into other areas.
Andres, thank you so much for that. Thanks to everyone for your questions. I'd now like to hand over to wrap up our session to Rabbi Mauricio Balter, the Executive Director of Masorti Olami. Mauricio, I think you just vanished.
Thank you, Matt, for
Here you are, back again.
your moderation. And as always, Andres give us a lot of information, insights, and material for think. Really, thank you very much, Andres. Each time is a pleasure to hear you and to learn from you. And I want to invite you the next week. We are producing together with the Masorti movement in Israel, broadcasted Megillat Esther reading from the Kotel, the egalitarian Kotel. As you are, all of you invited, you will receive the information, the flyer, but it's important, and we have another activities that we are producing in Zoom at this time. And for Masorti Olami, it's well to do in Zoom because you are around the world and not in one city. And please, if you have questions, ideas, or needs from your community or from your place, send us an email with your request, and we would like to check how we can to help you. Thank you very much, and Nitrai Bekarov.
Thank you, guys.
And thank you to Taylor for all the technical support always.